In today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at the question of whether the four jhanas, these deep states of meditative absorption, whether they're really necessary for attaining enlightenment in early Buddhism. It's a complex and somewhat controversial topic coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org. If you want to see some courses that'll teach you a bit about the Dharma of early Buddhism, take a look over there. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when they come out with new videos. So, jhanas. There's four of these states. They're called jhanas in early Buddhism that are the four sort of progressively deeper states of meditative absorption, of more deeply pleasurable states that come up when we're in these kinds of meditation. And the question is, how necessary are they? Now, if we look at some of the earliest examples of descriptions of the Buddha's own enlightenment, we'll find that the Buddha attains these jhanas in order, basically just before he attains that enlightenment. That is to say, he attains these four jhanas, then he says, when my mind had become immersed in samadhi like this, samadhi being another word for concentration, or jhana in this case, his mind becomes purified, bright, flawless, rid of corruptions, pliable, workable, steady, and imperturbable. Then the Buddha says, having done all of that, he extends his mind towards various knowledges, which are important to the Buddha's awakening or enlightenment. The most important of which is the knowledge of the destruction of the defilements, that is to say, the ending of greed, hatred, and delusion. And it's said that this knowledge of the destruction of the defilements is gained through the knowledge of what we might term the Four Noble Truths, that is to say, the knowledge of suffering, the knowledge of the origin of suffering in clinging and craving, the knowledge of the destruction of suffering or the end of suffering through the ending of that same craving, and the knowledge of the path or the way to the ending of suffering, that is the Eightfold Path. And these are understood through this process of meditation and deep seeing, that he's seen this suffering, he's seen why it is there, he's seen it go away, and he understands how and why it's gone away. Now, in other passages in the early texts, a couple of other suttas at least, the Buddha discusses the way that other arahants, other disciples of his, become enlightened as well, and he discusses them in essentially exactly the same terms. That is to say, that these other arahants, these other enlightened beings, become enlightened through the same process the Buddha himself used. That is, among other things, they attained these four jhanas in succession, gained these knowledges, gained the knowledge of the destruction of the defilements through the knowledge of these noble truths, or through the knowledge of suffering and so on. And as a result, it seems that jhana was very important. And this is also one of the reasons why we might say jhana comes as really the eighth stage in the Eightfold Path. If we know the Eightfold Path, and I'm not going to go into all of the stages here, but at the very end of that Eightfold Path we have questions about meditation. In other words, the last two are right mindfulness is the seventh, and right concentration is the eighth. And it ends, the Eightfold Path ends in right concentration. And right concentration in the early texts is generally understood to mean attainment of the four jhanas. So we might think from this plan of the Eightfold Path that jhana comes at the end, that jhana is essentially necessary, that without attaining jhana, indeed without attaining all four jhanas, we don't have any possibility of attaining enlightenment. This is one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves, is whether that's true, because it seems to be that that's the case, at least from the discussion that we're just having now. And this question of jhana has concerned and perturbed Buddhists for generations now. Indeed, in the late 19th and early 20th century in Burma, a man named, a monastic named Lady Sayadaw, sort of did a revolution in Buddhism. At least he's one of the people who crystallized this revolution of considering jhana as less important. Jhana is, to be sure, difficult to attain. It takes a lot of meditation to get there. It's not the sort of thing that most lay people have the time or energy to do. We just don't have time to meditate for several hours every day for days and weeks and months on end. And Lady Sayadaw's belief was that jhana was not necessary, that we could gain enlightenment without it, through a process of what's called dry awakening. This kind of dry awakening means awakening without, or enlightenment without, jhana. We might also call it dry insight. Dry insight is probably the more accurate term. And this is where we get the term insight meditation from. That is to say, the true way that we gain awakening or enlightenment is through insight into the 3 marks of existence. And I did a video on that. I'll put a link to it down below in the show notes if you want to know more. But in a nutshell, this means insight into the fact that all of existence is to some extent unsatisfactory. It's suffering, dukkha. Also, it's changeable. It's never permanent. There's nothing that we can grab onto and expect to persist. And also, it's all non-self, that wherever we look, we don't find a permanent self for us. So whatever experience we take in, that experience is not who we are. And these 3 marks of existence, insight into them is what gives us eventual enlightenment, not jhana in particular. That was sort of Lady Sayadaw's point here, and why he believed that one could actually go straight to enlightenment without jhana. Now, more recently, there has been some pushback on this within elements of the monastic and lay tradition in the West and various people. One example is Ajahn Brahm. There are many of them. He's a Western monastic in Australia who teaches jhana. Another one, a lay person who I've mentioned on many of these videos before, Lee Brasington, who also teaches jhana. Many people nowadays are bringing jhana back into our practice, at least for those people who can manage to get it, who have the time for it. And their argument is that jhana was important. It was something that the Buddha did believe was important. He discussed it many, many, many times in the suttas. And so that perhaps we should really consider undertaking that kind of practice ourselves. As I noted in a recent video of mine, and again, I'll leave a link to all this stuff down below. As I noted in that video, in an early text, jhana is described as temporary liberation. That is to say, liberation from our ordinary underlying tendencies towards greed, hatred, and delusion. These underlying tendencies are temporarily out of our minds, that we don't have them anymore while we're in the state of jhana. Now, of course, when we come back out of the state, then these underlying tendencies come back, but at least temporarily we're away from them. And if we frame jhana in those terms, we see that it potentially is something quite beneficial. However, there are several passages in the early texts that give us reason to say that jhana really isn't quite so important. That is to say, it is important, but we shouldn't make it more important than it really is. And what I'll do in much of the rest of this video is to go through some of these texts and discuss what they show us. In the first place, it's clear that jhana isn't sufficient for liberation. That is to say, we can have jhana and not be liberated. I think that may seem uncontroversial to you, but there are texts that make this clear. In particular, one text discusses how a monastic may become proficient in all 4 jhanas and yet decide to leave the sangha. They may, if they are not careful with their actions, they may wander into villages and get caught into the discussions among lay people and controversies among lay people and decide that they would prefer to be back in the village again. And that may happen even if they are proficient in jhana, which again goes to show that jhana itself is not sufficient. Now, this is perhaps not surprising because many of us will know that lay people can themselves attain jhana. Even back in the Buddha's day, lay people were able to attain jhana, and nowadays for certain lay people can. So we know that the attainment of jhana is not something that's exclusive to monastics, and so perhaps it's not so surprising that monastics can decide to give up the robes even if they're very good at jhana. Secondly, there are a number of early suttas that discuss the way that jhana may actually lead us astray in certain respects. One of the famous early suttas is called the Brahmajala Sutta, and this is a sutta where the Buddha discusses a number of wrong views that people may have. And 4 of these wrong views discussed in the Brahmajala involve the possibility of people taking each of these jhanas, each of these 4 jhanas, as enlightenment itself, as awakening, as nirvana. And this possibility, at least I would say, suggests that people during the Buddha's day did just this. That is to say, they would attain the first jhana, or the second, or the third, or the fourth, and think, now I've become enlightened. They would think, now I have attained nirvana because I've had this beautiful experience in meditation that seems to come up from nowhere. Now I'm enlightened. And the Buddha quite plainly says this is a wrong view. And so that demonstrates for us that in certain ways, in certain respects, jhana can at least, again, under certain conditions, can lead us astray. Secondly, we can become attached to jhana in a way that stimulates our underlying tendency to have a desire to be reborn. So the Buddha says that if we practice jhana, any of these jhanas, he says, if we practice them, and he says if you abide in it, are committed to it, and meditate on it often without losing it, we can get ourselves into a situation where we are reborn into that jhana state when we die. So if we spend time in the first jhana and are committed to it and all the rest, we can be reborn into the corresponding jhana realm of the first jhana in our next life. That is a realm where we spend our entire lifetime in that jhanic state. And the same with the second, the third, and the fourth. And this is exactly the same as the Buddha would say that if you do the same with any of the Brahmaviharas, that is loving kindness meditation or compassion meditation or sympathetic joy or equanimity, we can be reborn in the corresponding Brahmavihara realm, the Brahma realm, that corresponds to each of those, whichever one we happen to make more of the abode of our heart, if you like. And the same if we spend time in the formless attainments, which are these 4 deep attainments of formless meditation. We can get reborn in these formless realms. Now, so in that sense, jhana is on all 4s with these. It's exactly the same. The jhanas are just as problematic as any of these other ones. At least that's how it's presented in these suttas. And I've presented this as an issue of rebirth, that we're reborn into the next realm when we die. If we're coming from, as I do, a more sort of secular perspective, where we leave aside questions of literal rebirth, the point is the same. That is to say, even if we set aside questions of literal rebirth, still the question is, to what extent are we becoming attached to these states? And we can become attached to them to the point where we see ourselves being reborn there, to the point where we want to be reborn there, where we want to spend an eternity in that state. That is a form of attachment, and it's problematic for the Buddha. It's problematic for us because it can create dukkha, it can create suffering when we're no longer in that state, as we won't when we come out of it. Now, these attachments to jhanic states and to other states of deep meditation are subtle attachments. We should understand them. For the Buddha, they're not gross and important attachments, particularly important attachments, such as our attachment to sense pleasures in particular. These are subtle attachments, but they're no less real for being subtle, and I think we have to keep them in mind for that. Now, third, I want to turn to some passages from the early texts that seem to claim that meditation, or I should say that enlightenment, the attainment of enlightenment, nirvana, is possible even without jhana. In one of these, the Shorter Discourse on Emptiness, the Buddha discusses a a process, a practice that we can go through towards attaining enlightenment. And this is a practice that goes through the formless attainments, which are other states of meditative absorption, deep states of meditative absorption that don't involve jhana. Then from those states of meditative absorption, the formless attainments, we go to the formless, the signless concentration of mind. The signless concentration of mind is again a deep insight awareness. But then we go from there to an awareness of the impermanence of all of these states, including the impermanence of this signless concentration of mind, and then from that to nirvana itself. In this process, jhana itself is never mentioned. Now, the commentaries to this sutta were pretty clearly perturbed by that. And the commentaries therefore say that although jhana isn't mentioned here, it's understood to have been practiced at some point here. That's the question. Now, some people will argue that jhana is necessary as a preliminary practice in order to get ourselves into the formless attainments. This, however, is not clear. Certainly not clear to me. The Buddha was taught the formless attainments by his early teachers, Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta, who were before he was a Buddha, before Buddhism existed, that is to say. And so certainly if they practice these things through jhana, then jhana is a pre-Buddhist practice, which is not clear. It's also possible that we can attain these formless attainments through what's called kasina practices, in particular the kasina practice on emptiness, which is a practice involving a particular empty kind of a circular object that you put before you, and that helps you to understand emptiness that way, or non-existence that way, the space kasinas, I believe what it's called. And that can get us into these formless attainments directly, perhaps. These are questions, but all I'm saying is it's certainly not clear that the commentary is right in this circumstance. Anyhow, at first glance, this shorter discourse on emptiness provides us one route to enlightenment without jhana. Now, two other discourses, the discourse on the man from the city of Attaka and the shorter discourse to Malunkya, I'll have all these linked down below. Both of these suttas come at it from a different angle. They talk about how it's possible to attain enlightenment through any of the four jhanas, or through any of the four Brahmaviharas, that is to say, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, or through any of the first three of the formless attainments. If we are able to get into these states of samadhi, of meditative absorption, or deep meditation, if you like, and then come to be aware of them as changeable, as impermanent, as volitionally produced. That is to say that they're not permanent, that they're unsatisfactory in the sense that they will come to an end, they're produced by our own volitions. If we're able to do that with any of these states, we can become awakened thereby. And these two suttas make, I think, explicit that jhana itself is not necessary. That at the very least, we only need one of the four jhanas, and at the most, we only need one of the four Brahmaviharas. We only need, let's say, a loving kindness meditation and the insight awareness that this meditation is impermanent and volitionally produced in order to attain awakening. So we have a kind of a tension here between some texts that I mentioned at the beginning of this video that seem to indicate that jhana is necessary, and other texts which I've just now indicated that show that jhana is potentially problematic and not always necessary. At least not all of them, and maybe not any of them. So what do we make of this? Well, one thing that we might make of it is that the Buddha perhaps taught different ways to different people. That certainly is possible. It's also, I think, possible that the Buddha's teaching went through a process of, let's say, expansion over time. that when he began his teaching career, he would begin by teaching awakening the way he himself had achieved it. That is to say, since he himself had achieved it importantly through jhanic meditation, he began to teach it that way, that jhana was important, was necessary even. But that later on, perhaps, the Buddha would have become aware of other of his disciples who attained enlightenment through other means, perhaps, that may not have attained all of the jhanas, that didn't need the jhanas, didn't find them necessarily important in the way that he did, and that over time, therefore, the Dharmic teaching may have expanded to involve other potential routes towards awakening, that the path, this eightfold path, the path towards awakening, sort of broadened out over time as the Buddha began to realize that there were other avenues. The Buddha himself clearly had problems with pleasure when he was younger. That's why he undertook all of these difficult, painful kinds of austerities before he became awakened. And it was jhana that got him over that hump of being aversive to pleasure, to realize that there were some pleasures that we didn't need to be aversive towards, that is, jhanic pleasures. Other disciples, however, may not have had that same relationship to pleasure that he had, and so therefore might not have needed jhana in the same way he did. Which brings us to the last case, which may in some ways be the most famous of all of them in a way, which is a case out of what's called the Bahai Sutra. Here, a wanderer from a different sect named Bahai comes up to the Buddha and asks him about attaining awakening, attaining enlightenment. And because he's become aware of the fact that he is not himself awakened, not himself enlightened, but the Buddha is, and the Buddha can help him. And the Buddha gives Bahai a very, very short, compact discourse basically on perception, on allowing yourself to perceive the world directly without allowing, shall we say, unimportant or unskillful mental states to arise. And having heard that, it's said that Bahai became enlightened, became awakened immediately. And after that, he died soon. He died soon after becoming awakened. And what's clear from this passage in the Bahai Sutta is that the Bahai certainly did not attain the jhanas. Now, there are ways around this. There's some claims that the jhanas occur in one mental instant. That's a claim, I believe, out of the Theravada Abhidhamma. But that kind of point aside, which I don't consider particularly germane, frankly, I don't particularly find it credible, but nevertheless, it's one potential response. At least if we read the text as it is presented to us, Bahai becomes awakened, becomes enlightened without jhana. He becomes enlightened directly through hearing this discourse of the Buddha. Now, Bahai was a long-term ascetic. He had been an ascetic for quite a while and had a very accomplished career. At least that's what we're expected to understand here. And so he certainly would have, or most likely would have had some deep concentration practice. However, what that practice was, we don't know. If jhana was pre-Buddhist, if it was the kind of thing that everyone in India at his time was practicing, then it certainly is possible that he learned jhana before meeting the Buddha. But if jhana was not widely practiced or was a Buddhist invention of a kind, then Bahai certainly wouldn't have known of it. So what this case shows, just much like the others, is that while some concentration practice seems to be essential to awakening, to enlightenment, jhana itself may not be. What is important, however, is this, we might call, insight awareness into the impermanence of all things. This insight awareness into the impermanence of things which allows us to understand the noble truths. It allows us to see, frankly, where suffering arises from, and to get away from that by releasing the kind of clinging that we have to all things. This insight awareness is indeed the essence of what I think Bahai learns from the Buddha, although you might say he learns it indirectly, because he learns it by understanding it through the senses and the way we're supposed to not cling to the senses and allow our monkey mind to get in the way. So the upshot again here is one of insight. And I did a prior video on what is insight meditation, and I'll put a link to it up here on the screen if you want to know more. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, please consider taking a look at my Patreon page and join us if you wish. Thanks to all my patrons over on Patreon. Thanks to all of you, and we'll catch you on the next video. Meanwhile, be well.